File into the bunker and take your seats. The broadcast is about to begin. From Fort Bragg, North Carolina, this is the Doomsday Clock. Stories from the brink of Armageddon. Brought to you by the 18th Airborne Corps.
Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks again for listening. Joe Bacino here. I'm very excited about my guest, Adam Higginbotham. He's on with us at the moment. Adam, thanks so much for joining us on the Doomsday Clock podcast.
Not at all. Thanks for having me.
Adam, you are a writer for The New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, a number of major publications. You've done some real serious work, major subjects. But what we're talking about is the Chernobyl disaster. And your book, your wonderful book, remarkable book, Midnight in Chernobyl, which puts together the full story of this major event in a way that I hadn't really understood before, and I think people hadn't really understood before.
It's interesting you should say that. I'm pleased that's the case. That's part of the reason that I wanted to write it in the first place, is because, I first came to the subject when I was reporting a piece that was originally intended just to reconstruct the events of the night of the disaster itself. I just wanted to write a magazine piece for the Observer magazine back in 2006 in time for the 20th anniversary of the accident. And it was only when I began talking to the eyewitnesses I tracked down for that magazine story that I realized that, despite the background reading that I'd done in what had been published up to that point in English, that, I understood very little of the story, and there were huge parts of it that had been reported in the West that were either absent or actually factually incorrect. So that's what set me out on the path to writing the book in the first place.
Yeah, what I really valued about this, and I think I've talked to you a number of times, this was a long journey for me to just make sure I had good command of what I was talking about here to hold this conversation. Before I started in the Army, I was a failed journalist. And I used to do long-form pieces every once in a while for the Albany Times-Union. I think the brilliance of this is it's a lot like Rick Atkinson is the master at this, in that it places the reader in the mind of a character, sometimes a minor character, sometimes a major character, from a major event in history. And it's novelistic in that sense, in that it gives a smell and a feel and a taste of the events that happened. It's remarkable in that sense.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that is really what I set out to do, was to kind of enable the reader to appreciate what it was like to have lived through these events. And part of my motivation for that was that when I began meeting people like Alexander Yevchenko and his wife Natalia, who were actually the first two eyewitnesses I interviewed at the very beginning of my magazine reporting on the subject, I realized that part of my misconceptions about the accident were rooted in my own misunderstandings of what life in the Soviet Union had really been like, because I was 17 years old when the accident happened. And so I grew up during the Cold War, and it was only when I began reporting this that I realized the extent to which, however much Soviet citizens' view of the West was colored by Soviet propaganda, the same was true to some extent of people like me who'd grown up in the West during the Cold War. And we were, raised to imagine that Soviet citizens were these kind of, mindless automatons marching in lockstep toward a kind of grim future, like the people in the old Apple commercial.
Right.
And it was only when I started talking to Alexander and his wife, that I realized that, they hadn't been much older than me when the accident happened, and they were very similar to me in that they had kind of hopes and aspirations and expectations of the future. They didn't think of themselves as victims of the socialist experiment. And indeed, the city they lived in was a really great place to live for people in the Soviet Union, and they, had these expectations of the future that were much more optimistic and positive and enthusiastic than I had ever imagined. And that was part of what I wanted to kind of bring to life in the book, because so many accounts that I'd read in English of the Chernobyl accident specifically previously, had cleaved to these stereotypical conceptions of Slavic victimhood, where everybody was a victim of the state, and their expectations of the future were uniformly narrow and dreadful. And I began to realize that, this was obviously a complex society, and that if I could succeed in bringing that to the page, then it would be a really compelling story.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about society there that was built around this plant. The origin of the story, or one of the ideas, one of the themes of the story, is the power of the atom and the dichotomy of nuclear power to destroy. That's something we talk about on this show all the time. In this case, to give life. And this plant provided a real idyllic life for those who worked there and who lived near it. In fact, there was an entire, almost a universe that was built around Chernobyl that was a higher quality of living than the standard Soviet man or woman. Is that right?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the Soviet Ministry of Atomic Energy, deliberately built these places to attract the most talented and the most high-flying technicians and engineers from around the Soviet Union. So, somebody like Alexander Yevchenko, for instance, he wanted to go and work at Chernobyl not merely because it was one of the highest, best-performing nuclear plants with the greatest reputation and the most advanced technology in the USSR, but he also knew that if he moved there, he and his fiancée would be able to have their own flat within 6 months, instead of, by contrast, most Soviet citizens might put themselves down for a place in an apartment complex, and they might not get their own apartment for 10 years or 15 years. These things are available through the state, indeed were only available through the state. But in most cases, you had to wait years for anything to happen. Whereas because the city of Pripyat and the plant were paid for by the Ministry of Energy, they had special budgetary allocations that freed up the resources and made the infrastructure and the housing and the foodstuffs in the supermarkets and consumer goods available that were not available even in big cities elsewhere in the Soviet Union. So the supermarkets in Pripyat, the city that was built purely to house the workers and their families who worked at the plant, in the supermarkets you could buy 7 different kinds of sausage, and you could buy mutton, and you could buy beef. You could buy fresh tomatoes, which are kind of unheard of delicacy in the Soviet Union at the time. So when you talk to people who lived in Pripyat at the time, they're not people who look back on their time living next to the nuclear plant as one of a kind of period of benighted suffering in the USSR. They really miss it. They really loved living there.
Mm. And Viktor Bryukhanov is such a richly drawn character. He is really involved in the full sweep of the story and goes through almost a full evolution. Who is Viktor Bryukhanov?
So Bryukhanov was the director of the power plant. He was the administrative and managerial head of the entire enterprise, which in the Soviet system meant that he was responsible not just for managing the technical side of the plant, but for constructing it from the ground up, from the very outset, and then responsible for building and running the city that would accommodate its workers. So this is something that, when I first began reading about the background of the story, really fascinated and gripped me, which was that, this is a tale that begins with this bright, ambitious technician at the age of 34 being taken to an empty, snow-covered field in Ukraine and told that this is the place where he's going to build the biggest nuclear power station in the world, and ends with him decades later as a broken man, largely forgotten by the public, sitting in this flat in Kiev, expressing his lack of regret in many ways over the path that he has taken, but still taking blame in part for what happened. And it's a kind of Dickensian or Shakespearean story arc for one man, which I found very compelling at the outset.
The book opens with this element of, if you wrote this into a novel, it would be too on the nose. It would be almost edited out, I think. The idea that he approved the statue of Prometheus in Pripyat to represent, the power and the future and the ambition of Chernobyl, without really understanding that Prometheus, unleashed horrors onto the world through his ambition.
That's right. I mean, what I didn't realize, I think, when I began reporting the book is that Bryukhanov was not alone in this misconception or his limited view of the myth of Prometheus. It was because Prometheus was actually used as a symbol of the atomic energy industry throughout the Soviet Union. And of course, they chose only to see the story of Prometheus within the context of him bringing fire and with it, warmth and light to humanity. But failed to notice the end of the story, where his theft of the gift of fire from Olympus is punished by him being chained to a rock to have his liver pecked out every day for eternity by a giant eagle, and humanity is punished by the contents of Pandora's box.
Right, yeah. And so that maybe brings us to what happened. And a lot of people don't really understand what happened. You know, I think I was telling you the other day, I've had the unfortunate experience of investigating an Army training death. There's an exhaustive study whenever there's a training fatality. And you find there's never one thing that failed. There's a dozen things. There's enough standards were overlooked. There's multiple checks not done. There's a sense of there's a design flaw, a system flaw, some sort of inadequate leadership. And then you find all of these things happened multiple times. This wasn't just the first circumstance of this. And that certainly seems to be the case here.
That's true. I mean, the accident was a confluence of many different elements. You know, there were design flaws, there were decades of ignored warnings of minor failures and discovered flaws. There was human error on the night of the accident itself, and then there was the secrecy that, you know, ran through everything in the Soviet Union and the atomic industry in particular that complicated and exacerbated all of the foregoing three problems. And it was this chain of events that really went back 10, 20 years that ultimately resulted in the accident on April the 26th.
It's interesting you mentioned the design flaws. Maybe we go through what happened and thereby explain what the flaws were and how this went wrong. It starts on really the evening of Friday, April 25th, 1986, and then goes into the morning. Early morning is when they really had a problem. Is that right?
That's right, but I mean, it's important to understand that really the roots of the accident lay in these design flaws that I mentioned, and those themselves, you know, are a result of the limitations of the Soviet system. So the problems began with the very design of the reactor itself, which was known as the RBMK in Russian. And this was a reactor design that was unlike most reactors in the West and was developed from a military reactor that was originally devised to manufacture plutonium for use in atomic weapons. And the advantage that this reactor design had was that it was very easy and cheap to build and to scale up from its original design. And the only problem with that is that as they made it bigger, it became intrinsically more unstable and harder to control. So you start off on a design platform, essentially, with a nuclear reactor that's inherently unstable. And then they introduced further design flaws into the reactor as it was refined and constructed. And the most significant of these on the night of the accident was the control rods, which under ordinary circumstances are used to control the level of reactivity in the reactor core, which increases or decreases reactor power. So if you push the rods in, then reactor power decreases. If you pull the rods out, broadly speaking, then reactor power increases. Now, the problem was that in the event of an emergency shutdown, the way that you would bring that about as a reactor operator was simultaneously reintroduce all of the control rods into the reactor at the same time. Now, the design fault of the control rods that was most significant was the fact that the ends of the rods were tipped with graphite, and this meant that they discovered long before the accident that for a brief fraction of a second when they were introduced into the core of the reactor, instead of immediately reducing reactor power, these tips had the effect of briefly increasing reactor power. So it was as if you're driving a car in which the accelerator and the brake pedals are wired in reverse. So you want to come to a sudden stop, you stamp on the brakes, and instead of coming to a halt, the car briefly accelerates. So on the night of the accident, what happened is that because they were conducting a safety test,
and this is a normal standard test, as I understand it, as you describe it.
It wasn't a standard test. It was a test designed to test the safety equipment that would be necessary in the event of an emergency blackout, which would suddenly deprive the power station of electricity. But it was a test that had been conducted previously on reactors at Chernobyl, in fact, but it had never been successful. And it was a test that they could really only conduct when they were about to conduct a regular maintenance shutdown. So it wasn't something they could do at any time, because the maintenance shutdowns only happened every 4 years or so. So they were really under a lot of pressure, not only to conduct this test, but unlike all previous attempts to conduct the test on other reactors, they were under pressure to make it work. And the way in which they set up the reactor for the test meant that this already unstable, intrinsically unstable reactor was put into an extremely unstable state, operating at very low power, which many people who worked at the plant knew was unwise in the first place. But they went on with the test nonetheless, and as far as they were concerned, as far as the operators in the reactor control room were concerned, the test, which was to last only a matter of seconds, went off successfully. And it was only after they introduced the control rods as part of the standard shutdown procedure. They pressed the emergency shutdown button, which was the final step before turning the reactor off, effectively, and then just proceeding with a cooling period that you would usually have with a shutdown reactor. They introduced the emergency control rods to shut it down, not in response to an emergency, but because they wanted to end the test. And only then did they begin to see signs that something had gone wrong and that power was rising inside the reactor. And at that point, it was too late. And the next thing that happened was an explosion.
And this maybe is an opportunity to introduce one of the other really fully developed characters here is Anatoly Dyatlov. I guess in the HBO film, he is the real villain of this. And, you kind of describe him as the Soviet man. He's a party man in the sense that he is committed to the principles of the Soviet Union and to Chernobyl. I saw this Discovery Channel show that just blamed him for the entire thing.
Yeah, I mean, both that and the HBO show especially is a sort of gross, convenient oversimplification of the truth and is based, I think, more in sort of off-the-peg Hollywood stereotypes than in reality.
Right. He was, in your book at least, a really difficult person. And
a martinet, I would say. He was, he was like a Captain Bligh character in the sense that there are, people regarded him as an extremely competent technician, but many people personally disliked him. On the other hand, there were many people who thought that he was extremely effective and had a great deal of respect for him. So it wasn't as if when I interviewed people in my research for the book, I came across this kind of blanket interpretation of his personality as a terrible human being and a martinet. Because obviously, in life, you rarely come across people who are sort of Manichaean. And his background and his character were not that simple. But he was certainly not an easy person to work for. And the most significant real sort of character flaw he had is that he would brook no argument with his instructions. So although other technicians in the control room that night did not want to proceed with the test and certainly would have been in a position to suspect that something might go wrong if they did proceed with it, because it went against several different regulations to proceed with the test with the reactor in the condition it was in when they commenced the test. Dyatlov insisted on going on with it regardless.
And that certainly doesn't help. I mean, there are opportunities here to confront this or to stop this, and so on some level, he is a guilty party here.
Yes, and you raise an interesting point, which is it's actually very hard to say at what point in the process leading up to the final decision to release the control rods into the reactor that the process could have been stopped and the explosion that resulted avoided. When I asked Nikolai Steinberg, who was in charge of the final investigation, the most open investigation and the most conclusive investigation into what caused the accident, at what point it would have been possible to turn back without causing an accident, he had to admit that he didn't really know. And the truth is that possibly as soon as the shift of workers entered the control room at midnight on Friday the 25th, it was kind of already too late.
Mm. I've heard you talk about, you've used this expression, the normalization of deviance. Can you explain what that means in terms of not just Chernobyl, but in major system failures?
Yeah, this is a concept that I only know of through reading. The sociologist Diane Vaughan wrote a book called The Challenger Launch Decision, which is about actually the subject of the book that I'm working on at the moment, which is the space shuttle program and the Challenger disaster. And my understanding, and forgive me if this is a kind of hopeless bowdlerization of the concept, of the normalization of deviance, is simply that when dealing with complex systems and in complex organizations, what can happen is that you experience a series of abnormalities in the processes that you're governing. And because nothing untoward happens, or nothing too untoward happens, each time you have one of these minor mishaps, you come to accept it as part of the normal cost of doing business. And that constantly raises your threshold of what you'll tolerate going wrong in the system. And this is something that happened in Chernobyl and that similarly happened at NASA with the Challenger accident and then subsequently with the Columbia accident.
You know, we got to have you back on when that book is out. The Challenger is another critical moment in the Cold War. Now we get into day 2. Now April 28th, which is, it's actually the third day. So Monday, April 28th, things kind of get worse. There's a massive explosion. And then your book introduces another interesting character, a Swede named Cliff Robinson, who I think at this point, the scope of the problem maybe is not clear.
Well, it's not clear necessarily to people in the Politburo, including Mikhail Gorbachev, possibly not. It's certainly not clear to anyone outside the Soviet Union.
And so what's Cliff Robinson's role here?
So Cliff Robinson is an interesting character because he is a person who effectively alerted the rest of the world outside the USSR that something had gone seriously wrong at Soviet nuclear plant. He worked in one of the testing laboratories at the Forsmark nuclear power station in Sweden, and he arrived at work very early at the plant on the morning of Monday the 28th. And as he was coming into the plant from having his coffee break in the plant coffee room, he set off one of the radiation detectors at the entrance to the building. And he thought this was very peculiar because he hadn't yet actually been inside the reactor building. So he and the guy in charge of radiation monitoring, who came down from upstairs, were sort of bewildered by the fact that he could be setting off this alarm without having been anywhere where he could become contaminated. And initially they just thought that this was because the measuring equipment was miscalibrated, and they eventually resolved to kind of tinker with it and get on with the day. And so Robinson went to work then up in the lab, but then he came down a bit later, and because it's Sweden and they like having coffee breaks, he came back down and have another cup of coffee a little bit later, and discovered to his consternation that there was this huge line of other workers coming to work in the plant, all of whom were setting off the same radiation detector. So he took one of the shoes off one of the guys who'd set off the detector and put it in a plastic bag to prevent cross-contamination, and then went upstairs to his lab to check it himself. And what he discovered is that the sole of this guy's shoe had a whole series of radioactive elements in whatever was on the bottom of it that he eventually deduced had come from a nuclear reactor, but not one like the one where he worked at Forsmark.
Oh my God!
But it took him some time to come up with these results, and in the intervening time, the local authorities had shut down and evacuated the plant, and placed a police cordon around it, and sent word to the central authorities in Stockholm that something disastrous was happening. By which time, using detection equipment that was actually used to help monitor the International Test Ban Treaty on nuclear testing, the Swedish authorities had established beyond doubt that this contamination that Cliff Robinson had come across before 8 o'clock that morning was actually part of something that had drifted over Sweden from inside the borders of the Soviet Union, and it had come from a nuclear reactor that had been exposed to the air. So at that point, Swedish diplomats began asking questions of the authorities in Moscow. Only the Moscow authorities continued to deny any knowledge of anything going wrong inside the Soviet borders. And they continued to deny that all day, even as the Politburo was meeting in Moscow, and Gorbachev and the other apparatchiks at the head of Soviet government were debating the information that they'd already received from Chernobyl over the weekend and whether or not to release information about it.
Yeah, and then you described this meeting. It's another brilliant scene, this really tense meeting of the Politburo, and there was certainly an opportunity to in some way contain this or in some way lessen the damage. There had to have been, if there were a more transparent response. And Gorbachev, my understanding of Gorbachev was that he was committed to a more transparent Soviet Union. Nonetheless, there's a very limited statement that goes out, they're deceptive about the whole thing. And what might have been, what's potentially a counterfactual here if, that Gorbachev directed the Soviet Union, the top of the Soviet Union, to be very honest and transparent with the world about what had happened?
Well, it's an interesting question because, in retrospect, Gorbachev has, always keen to burnish his own image, has insisted that they didn't release more information about what had really happened at the time simply because they hadn't received complete information themselves. But even if that's true, the statement that they did release on Monday evening was extremely limited, and what one of the people in the propaganda department in Moscow at the time described as the traditional approach, which is, attempting to minimize all bad news and essentially denying that anything could go wrong with the wonderful Soviet system and Soviet technology in particular.
Maybe just to set the listener up, if I could just read the statement. So this is, Monday night, 8 p.m., so this is now almost 3 full days after the explosion. So this is the statement that Gorbachev approved. This is it. An accident has taken place at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. One of the atomic reactors has been damaged. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences of the accident. Aid is being given to those affected. A government commission has been set up. Now, that would lead you to believe that this is largely contained.
Yes, it's enviable use of the passive voice. And, significantly doesn't mention the release of radioactivity or when the accident has even happened.
Right.
And so there's two things going on here. One is that they're pursuing the same course of action that they would in terms of news reporting outside the Soviet Union, which is essentially to deny that anything has happened, or at least to minimize information about what has happened. But the other is that they've got at least one eye on what's going on inside their own borders. So they don't want to release information to their own population. And this is really where I think your counterfactual suggestion, the difference would have been made, because they refused to evacuate the city of Pripyat and the area immediately around the reactor in the hours after they knew that a large and very significant accident had taken place. And the part of the motivation for that was that they didn't want word getting out beyond the borders of the plant and the town, because they knew that, Pripyat had a population of about 50,000 people. And if they evacuated all of these people into the surrounding countryside, then there was no way they could stop word leaking out of a catastrophe of some kind. So they delayed the evacuation, and that put all of those people potentially in harm's way and helped spread illness and confusion. And so if they had, behaved as the Swedish authorities had done, for example, and as soon as they suspected an accident had taken place, placed a perimeter around the plant and evacuated people from the neighborhood, then a lot of that strife could have been avoided. More broadly, if they had owned up to foreign countries in Europe and in the United States that they'd had a reactor accident, then they could have got expertise from abroad to come in and help mitigate the results of the disaster. But of course, they didn't want to do that because there was a blanket of secrecy over everything to do with nuclear weapons and to do with nuclear energy within the Soviet Union. So there's no way they were going to let any Western experts anywhere near the plant. And that continued to be true for months and years afterwards.
So we're still on Monday, April 20th. There's a number of things that happened that day that are remarkable events. And one of them is the start of these helicopter runs where they're dropping sand into the reactor to, I guess, parachuting absorbent and just dropping sand to try to, basically cover this over or contain any of the spillage or the toxicity coming out of it.
That's right. And actually, Major General Nikolai Antoshkin, who was the commander of this operation, just died a couple of days ago when we were having this conversation. He had complications of COVID-19.
Oh, my God.
So, yes, really out of desperation because they didn't know what else to do. They realized that the reactor was open to the air and that it seemed to be burning and was releasing a great deal of radioactivity and radioactive particles into the atmosphere. So they eventually decided that they would use helicopters to bombard the open reactor core from the air with a combination of different materials that the atomic experts calculated would help to reduce the possibility of a meltdown, would snuff out a fire, would prevent further radioactive particles being released into the atmosphere. So it was sand, boron, which would reduce the possibility of a further chain reaction, lead, which was designed to melt and cool the nuclear material that was in the core, and clay, which was intended to place a kind of seal over the top of things and stop radionuclides getting into the atmosphere. And they began this operation on Sunday, and they had, dozens of helicopter crews were flown in from all over the Soviet Union, and they conducted this operation for, I don't remember exactly now, more than a week, I think, in an attempt to kind of smother the reactor. And this was an extremely heroic exploit, but subsequently discovered to be completely pointless, as they were trying to target this thing from hundreds of meters in the air, and almost every single one of these loads that they were dropping by eye, from open helicopter doors to begin with, and then from parachutes slung upside down containing their loads that were carried underneath each individual helicopter. Very few of these loads got anywhere near the reactor core itself and were dropped a long way off target. And they think now that the fire just went out on its own.
Mm. The other thing that comes into the conversation here, and it comes into the book here, is the idea of the China syndrome. And I thought this movie was about 3 Mile Island, but the movie came out right before that.
Was it right before it or right after it? It was within days, I think, of
less than a
3
month.
Mile Island happening.
Yeah, but right before. And the movie is about, this was in 79, right? 3 Mile Island was
That's
79.
right.
Yeah. The movie, I remember the movie. I remember seeing the movie. I guess I thought it was, I saw it after 3 Mile Island. I saw it in the early 80s. I thought it was about that. Jane Fonda plays a TV reporter who discovers that uranium fuel is burning through the base of a nuclear reactor in California, and that it's going to go all the way into China and contaminate most of the world.
Well, that's the threat that is described to her by one of the technicians who she consults when she's reporting on this nuclear plant where they've discovered that safety procedures have been overlooked and that the X-rays that have been made as part of safety inspections on the plumbing around the nuclear reactor have been falsified, making it possible that under certain circumstances a meltdown is going to occur in this reactor in California. And then, it's explained in this very dramatic scene, then the China syndrome will take place. And that indeed, it will melt through the bottom of the reactor vessel and then keep going into the earth below until it comes out onto the other side of the earth in China, which is, as it turns out, not only geologically but also geographically impossible.
Right.
Yes, but
right.
The concept of the China syndrome was more realistically an absolutely real fear, which was that the molten nuclear material in the event of a meltdown of a reactor core would become so hot that it would burn through the concrete at the bottom of the reactor vessel and then pass through the foundations of the reactor building and into the earth below. And this was absolutely something that the Soviet technicians were terrified was going to take place in reactor number 4. And indeed, this material that they eventually called corium, which is a combination of molten uranium and melted concrete and metal from the reactor vessel that was combined into a kind of red-hot radioactive soup, did indeed escape from the reactor vessel and began leaking through the foundations of the basement rooms beneath the reactor vessel and down towards the foundations and towards the water table of the building. But part of the problem here was that it was so radioactive and so dangerous that nobody could get near it to figure out exactly what was going on inside the ruins of Reactor 4. And the technicians' estimates of what was going on were based on readings of radioactive particles in the air, so they could tell from the decay products that they could detect in the air what was going on to some extent, and from taking remote temperature readings. So they were kind of guesstimates of what was going on. But they then launched this enormous operation on several different fronts to try and mitigate the effects of what they feared was going to happen, which was this blob of corium burning through the basement of the building. They feared two things. One was that they had these enclosed compartments half filled with water directly beneath the reactor vessel, which were originally constructed as part of a steam management safety system. And they feared that if the red-hot material suddenly made contact with this water, it would cause a massive steam explosion that would destroy Reactor 4 and then destroy parts of the other reactors at the plant. There were 3 other reactors that were also built right next door to Reactor 4. And they feared that this would just effectively create a huge dirty bomb, launching radioactive material into the atmosphere and kind of blanketing a large part of the Western Soviet Union and making it uninhabitable for years afterwards. That was the first possibility. The second possibility was that somehow it passed through these tanks without causing an explosion, burned through the very foundations of the building into the earth below, and then made contact with the water table, where they feared an explosion, but more significantly, it contaminating the entire water supply through leaching radioactivity into the river Pripyat, which then fed into the river Dnieper, which then fed into the Black Sea, and therefore contaminating the drinking water of a huge number of Soviet citizens. So they launched these operations to try and stop this happening.
So this is the same day still, that Reagan hears about this. He's on a first ever G7 meeting in Hawaii, and
That's right, he's on his way to Tokyo for the first ever G7 meeting.
Yeah, and so what's his reaction to this?
He issues a statement saying, rather predictably, saying, damning the Soviet reaction and saying that, the Soviet Union owes it to the world to come clean about what's happened.
And then there is an incredible effort, a remarkable effort to evacuate people out of Pripyat, to get everybody out. Really just a massive attempt and a heroic attempt, really, to get people out. Can you describe that?
Yes, and this is one of the things that you can point to, which is actually a success. Obviously, it would have been more of a success if they'd done it 48 hours earlier. But it's something that, it's one of many instances of the accident mitigation that you realize would only have been possible in a planned centralized economy like the Soviet economy, where, central authorities can turn this massive amount of resources suddenly to get a problem solved. And so, for all the other failures that take place, they managed to evacuate more than 25,000 people from Pripyat on Sunday afternoon in the space of a matter of hours. And so, at noon, they're all lining up to get on buses, which have been brought in from all over the area, 1,200 buses, and they bring in trains and they bring in boats. And by 6 o'clock, everybody's gone. It's hard to imagine happening in a Western country. So they do undertake this massive effort to evacuate people, and that is actually successful. But of course, it takes place on Sunday afternoon when the explosion itself took place in the early hours of Saturday morning.
And so, going through the story here, there's this really public and dramatic trial, and obviously this was a really tense set of scenes in the HBO show, but there's a trial that makes all of this public, and it happens pretty quickly after the accident.
Well, no, the trial takes place the following summer, and it was not really public. It was the way in which, this is very kind of Soviet framing of what happened, is that it's been described by some as a public trial in a closed zone. So nominally, the trial of the managers, including Viktor Burhanov and Anatoly Dyatlov, and the technicians who the Soviet authorities held responsible for the accident, scapegoated for the accident, was to take place in public. And indeed, anybody was allowed into the trial, but first of all, they would have to get into the exclusion zone that had been thrown around the plant, because the trial was conducted in the town of Chernobyl, which was inside the exclusion zone, and you couldn't get into the exclusion zone without a government pass and special permission. And they invited the press, but they only invited the press to the opening day of the trial, when opening statements were read and no questions were taken, and the closing day of the trial, when the sentences were handed down and closing statements were read. All of the rest of the trial was held in closed session. And we only know the testimony that was given those days because there were people from the plant who they couldn't keep out of the proceedings, who went and in secret took shorthand notes.
And ultimately, there's sentences handed down. There's prison sentences. Dyatlov, I think, was sentenced to 10 years and ended up serving 5. His sentence at a certain point was commuted.
Yes, because he was sick, because he was suffering from the effects of radiation sickness that he suffered as a result of his exposure on the night of the accident.
Right. And then one thing about Dyatlov is that, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's revealed at some point in between, maybe while he was in prison or before the trial, that his son died, that there was another accident that occurred that he knew about and was at least maybe partly responsible for, and then his son died as a result of some of the after effects?
We don't know if his son died as a result of the after effects. What we know is that before Dyatlov worked at Chernobyl, he worked in a secret laboratory, which I think was named Laboratory 23, in the Soviet Far East. And he oversaw the design and construction and installation of marine reactors in Soviet nuclear submarines. And so that's where he learned his trade, really, in dealing with reactors. And at some point during his time working there was a reactor accident, and he was exposed to a pretty significant dose of ionizing radiation. And at some point after that, he had 2 sons, and one of his sons died of leukemia. So we don't know that those 2 events are connected, nor do we know that Dyatlov himself definitely believed that the 2 things were connected. But it seems possible. And certainly, the loss of his son was obviously a significant event in Dyatlov's life and overshadowed the rest of his life. And it's something that when one of the reactor operators who was in the reactor control room for reactor number 4 on the night of the accident, Leonid Toptonov, who had only just qualified to do the job, he died as a result of the radiation that he was exposed to in trying heroically but ultimately pointlessly to mitigate the results of the accident. And his mother, who I interviewed when I was researching the book a couple of times, was sent a letter by Dyatlov after he was sent to prison in which he apologized for what had happened and said that Toptonov, who at that point also, even though he had died, was being held responsible and scapegoated for causing the accident. He wrote to Vera Toptonov saying that he knew that Leonid was not responsible for what had happened. And as part of that letter, he said, I know the pain of losing a child.
Oh, my God. I saw this interview that Dyatlov did after he was released from prison, and he was fairly unapologetic. He basically blamed the process, the reactor, the Soviet system. He certainly didn't absorb or assume any responsibility.
No, and he spent the last years of his life attempting to absolve not only the other operators, but also himself of responsibility for what had happened. But he was right, because to a certain extent, because the Soviet authorities attempted to scapegoat the operators and just blame them entirely for what had happened, when the truth was that, had the reactor not been badly designed, had the reactor operators been kept fully informed of the problems, had they been told why a lot of the rules that were in place, that they were effectively forced to break by the pressure that was put on them to meet targets and to bend rules. Nobody told them why these rules were in place in the first place or the possible consequences of breaking them.
Right. At the time of the trial, really around this time, there's a number of forces pressing on the Soviet Union, and maybe here we zoom out to the Cold War, and a geopolitical view of this is the Soviets had dumped, just as we had really, just an enormous treasure on the arms race. Public opinion had turned against them, and really Ronald Reagan was at least in part responsible, doing a masterful job of portraying the Soviet Union as the evil empire. They'd been bogged down in Afghanistan. There was the collapse of the international oil markets, and then there was Chernobyl. And so some things you read and some accounts point a direct line from Chernobyl to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in your book, there is a line, but it's a little bit more complicated and maybe not a direct line.
I think that some people have been tempted to suggest that the simple financial cost of Chernobyl was so expensive that this helped, bankrupt the Soviet state, and thus, brought about the end of the Soviet Union. But, if you look at the size of the Soviet GDP, relative to the cost of Chernobyl, that's clearly impossible. Mm-hmm. I think there were several things going on. One of them, William Taubman, who wrote the most recent sort of doorstop biography of Mikhail Gorbachev, makes a very convincing argument that one of the most significant contributions that Chernobyl made to the downfall of the Soviet Union was in what it did to Mikhail Gorbachev's mindset and to his approach to governance. And he explains that essentially before Chernobyl took place, Gorbachev had aired these ideas of glasnost, of open government, and perestroika, of economic restructuring, but they were just slogans. He'd aired them at the Communist Party conference, but hadn't taken any action. And he was going slowly because he knew that he was surrounded by conservatives in the Politburo, and he didn't want to get unseated in the way that Khrushchev had for being perceived to be going too fast by changing things. But what Chernobyl brought home to him when he discovered that even this sort of blue chip operation that the Soviet nuclear industry was supposed to represent, even that was rotten to the core. He realized for the first time exactly how corrupt and how broken the system he'd inherited had become by 1986. And this encouraged him, convinced him really, that if he was going to save the Soviet Union from disintegrating on its own, then he needed to undertake these reforms seriously and quickly, and much more deeply than perhaps he had anticipated. And so he headed very swiftly into this restructuring and changing of the Soviet economy, and did so quickly and so recklessly that was a major precipitating factor in the final disintegration of the Soviet Union itself. So these reforms that he brought on were done so ham-fistedly that was really what, unraveled the Union. At the same time, his interest in glasnost meant that he encouraged or permitted and then encouraged more open reporting on the Chernobyl catastrophe itself. In May 1986, he began allowing more open reporting of what was really going on and sort of lifted the corner of the blanket of secrecy on the Soviet state. And that really meant that the Soviet people began to find out the truth about, even to a small extent initially, of what had really happened, and therefore the truth of how corrupt and disorganized the nuclear state was and how badly mishandled the Chernobyl catastrophe had been. And this began an irreversible process of increasing openness in which the Soviet people began to realize how the Communist Party had failed in its duty of care to its people.
Right.
And that was another another irreversible trend that ultimately led towards the disintegration of the USSR.
Right. And also, it maybe gave the idea of Soviet science, of the spectacular nature of the Soviet scientific advance since Sputnik, it gave that the lie, or at least disproved part of that, didn't it? I mean, in terms of the reputational harm.
Yes, exactly. I mean, a lot of the reason that reporting about Soviet industrial and technological failures was so limited and so bowdlerized was because they needed to maintain this myth of Soviet military and technological primacy. The Soviet Union may have been a tough place to live. They maintained this impressive bulwark against the corruption of the capitalistic West, that their aircraft were the best, their nuclear plants were the best, they were the safest, their military technology led the world. And, when people began to realize not only how the nuclear technology itself had failed, but how the attempts to clean up and stop this contamination leaking around the USSR afterwards, when they realized that, they began to realize that clearly everything that they'd been told about Soviet technical primacy was not true.
Mm. One of the real flaws in the Soviet system here, and one of the real problems here was, so it was now Tuesday, so it's 4 days after, there's a New York Post headline, 2,000 die in nuke mare. That number was not accurate, not even close. But
Well, it's a thousand times more than the truth at that point.
Right, that's right, yeah. But, that's part of the problem of trying to contain something and deceive people about something that now has left your borders and now has become, if not just a regional problem, almost a global problem, at least a global item of interest.
Well, ultimately it did become a global problem because the plume from Chernobyl eventually enrobed the entire northern hemisphere.
And given that, we don't really understand the magnitude in terms of certainly millions affected, maybe 5 million plus affected, but the number of people that died as a result is unknown. I mean, we just know that it affected Belarus, Ukraine, areas...
And the Russian Republic.
The Russian Republic, enormous radioactive material. So the size and scope of this is just enormous. I mean, what's a parallel, really, in terms of... I'm not sure there is one.
Well, it's hard to say because, you'd be looking at natural disasters for a comparison like the explosion of Krakatoa in the 19th century. Because part of the problem with sort of getting your head around the nature of this catastrophe is that, firstly, the Soviet cover-up and failure to report or indeed gather a lot of information about the health effects of the radiation released by the explosion means that we can't really rely on any hard information about how many people were affected, especially when it's combined with the second problem, which is that the making a link between radiation exposure and various different diseases and cancers is extremely hard under the best of circumstances. So there's only one real hard example of a cancer, thyroid cancer, which it's very easy, relatively speaking, to link to radiation exposure. And with that, we know that we can say that between 5,000 and 10,000 people contracted thyroid cancer who would not have got it had reactor number 4 not exploded. But in terms of other kinds of solid cancers and leukemias and things, which exist in the human population in such large numbers already, it's very hard to filter out what number of those might have been caused by Chernobyl that would not have occurred had it not been for that explosion.
Right. I've read different accounts of what Pripyat looks like today. There's some, at least one, pretty significant account that it's almost like a paradise for nature and animals, and then there's another that it's still very contaminated. What's the truth?
The argument isn't really about how contaminated it is. It's about the long-term effect of that contamination, of chronic low-level radiation exposure on plants and animals. And there is this very appealing notion that was aired for the first time, I don't know, probably 20 years ago now, that, this sort of Gaian myth of nature triumphing in the face of man-made radiation, and that, plants and animals have returned to the contaminated areas of the exclusion zone and bear no ill effects and have triumphed despite man's worst efforts to the contrary. But the truth seems to be that plants and animals have indeed returned to the exclusion zone, and when you visit Pripyat now, it's overgrown with these kind of second areas of plants and trees like sprouting from steps and inside buildings, and you see moose wandering through the central square, and there are foxes and birds of prey that haven't been seen in Ukraine for years. And it is actually, especially if you visit in the summer, it's sort of wonderful. It's quite a spooky place to be, but it's sort of amazingly silent and impressive in the way that nature has claimed the place back. But the truth is that this is at least partly because, in the years before the accident, this was a semi-industrial zone, and Ukrainians are extremely enthusiastic hunters. And so it's the absence of men wandering around with rifles shooting the wild boar and the moose that's really the significant thing. That's why we see all of these animals inside the exclusion zone, is because there are no humans around to bother them. And have they triumphed in the face of radiation? Well, no, because two scientists, Moller and Musso, have written dozens of papers now showing how, this exposure to low-level radiation, especially in the most contaminated areas of the zone, have had these, profound and damaging effects on populations of swallows and rodents and other creatures that have come wandering into the exclusion zone. So although a lot of animals do make their way into the exclusion zone, their fear is that it's actually like a giant roach motel. A lot of animals come in, less animals go out.
The exclusion zone is 1,000 square miles around the site, around the Chernobyl site. How hard is it to get into the exclusion zone? What's required?
I think you can wander into the lobby of most hotels in Kiev these days and buy a ticket to get on a bus and be driven in there and taken around by a tour guide. And now, I mean, since I last went there, they have souvenir shops on the outskirts of the exclusion zone when you can buy, tchotchkes with like radioactive symbols on and T-shirts and mugs and stuff. It's not hard to get into the exclusion zone at all. Mm. It's become a major tourist attraction.
Right.
I mean, actually, the Ukrainian press about a year ago carried a report that said that tourism has now become such a significant thing in the exclusion zone that they've had to undertake a second cleanup. So originally there was the radioactive cleanup, and now they have the cleanup to pick up all of the trash that's been left behind by visitors.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it really would be something. At some point, I've got to visit. I've seen the images, but I imagine up front it's probably a bizarre thing to see, what's become of it. What was the experience like?
I mean, it is an interesting place to visit, partly because, it's like a sort of Soviet Pompeii. It's a lot of the architecture and stuff is just preserved as it was on the day in 1986 when most of the population left the town. And now I don't really know what it's like because I haven't been there for some years. And I understand that now it's very busy. And so you're stood in the central square for a few hours. You'd see, one bus full of tourists after another arrive and kind of make the rounds of the landmarks and kind of pose and take pictures in front of the Ferris wheel and the swimming pool and those things. But, I'd been there when it would just be me and my translator and the guide who was taking us around, because at that point the authorities dictated that everybody who goes there has to have a guide. And so you would be, one of only 3 people in an entire city. Mm. And that could be a quite unnerving experience, because you do get a sense of, especially if your friends disappear around a corner for 10 minutes, you get a real sense of what it's like to be the last person on Earth.
Mm. Well, a couple other things we should talk about here is, Chernobyl really destroyed, at least for a period of time, confidence in nuclear power, which, was something that Eisenhower always believed in, the peaceful power of the atom. And a number of countries halted their programs after this. You've looked at and you write about and you've talked about nuclear power, the sustainability, the safety, and where do you fall out on that?
What's my view? I mean, I think that the experts that I spoke to when I was researching the book suggested that although, renewable sources of energy like solar and wind, have become per unit of electricity generated much cheaper to install and operate than they were even 5 years ago, it still makes up such a small proportion of electricity generation globally. And the need for more electricity is still increasing, especially in the developing world, that in order to make the transition to carbon-neutral electricity generation at the speed we need to, we still need to replace fossil fuel burning plants with something as we transition to things like solar and wind. And at the moment, countries like India, for example, are just building more coal-fired plants. Mm. So just in order to make up that gap, we need to find something else. And nuclear would seem to be a viable solution to that problem. However, the central problem at this point is not really environmental, as far as I can see, but economic. It costs so much to build a nuclear power plant, and it takes so long to build using the technology we've been using, these massive plants, like the ones that we still have in the United States, that's not really a viable option. So if we were to use nuclear energy to bridge that gap between fossil fuels and renewables, it's going to need to be a different kind of nuclear technology. And the only way in a country like the United States that that's economically feasible at this point is for government to step in and pay for it, because private companies just can't afford it and they're not interested in it.
Mm. we should probably close out the story there. I do want to thank you for the book and maybe just talk about the effort here. I mean, this was an incredible journey for you to get all of this information, to uncover documents. You talked to people who nobody had ever spoken with before and brought to light something that was really misunderstood, and I think probably remains a little bit misunderstood.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's very flattering. I think it does remain misunderstood, and I think that to a certain extent it always will do, partly because, a lot of the record was deliberately buried by the Soviet authorities. What was your question, really?
Describe how long it took you to write this and, what lengths you went through here. I know you talked to a lot of people. I know you were exposed at some point to some level of radiation.
I worked on it for a long time. Because, as I said, I started reporting on it as a magazine story back at the end of 2005, at the beginning of 2006. And initially, I just intended to write a piece that was very closely confined to eyewitness statements about the night of the accident itself. And I approached it that way because I had recently read Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, which is an account of the sinking of the Titanic, which Lord based on interviewing survivors of the wreck and on the existing public record at that time. And it's a wonderful, extremely concise book that is literally just about that night in 1912 when the ship sank, and doesn't cover any of the preamble and doesn't talk about anything that happened afterwards. And having read it and being interested in writing about Chernobyl, I thought to myself, well, this is something that this is an approach that's never been taken to the Chernobyl accident. So I went and convinced my editors at the Observer magazine to let me find eyewitnesses to do that reconstruction. And then, to be honest, as soon as I had spoken to those people in Moscow and Kiev, I came back to New York and I thought, this is an amazing story, that there is definitely a book in this. Mm-hmm. But I just couldn't get arrested with it. Nobody cared. So then I just I forgot about it. And then that was the 20th anniversary in 2006. And then I pitched another story for the 25th anniversary in 2011, which was about this idea of the exclusion zone as this sort of radioactive Eden. And so then I went back again 5 years later and reported another magazine story about it, which I found just as fascinating and just as compelling. And then Fukushima happened literally months after I'd first gone out there for that story. And so that, I think, really changed the context in which people saw Chernobyl. And they no longer saw it merely as this sort of distant historical event. It seemed to have much more contemporary relevance and resonance. But at the same time, on that reporting trip, I did some things in the exclusion zone where I kind of frightened myself with my potential radiation exposure. And while still in the exclusion zone, I said to myself, I'm never returning to this terrible place. It's too frightening, and who knows what I've managed to do to myself while here in the interest of reporting a magazine story. What a fool. I'm never going to come back. 4 years later, I started thinking about yet another magazine story about the subject, and I realized at that point that this was something that really wasn't going to let go of me, and that the stories that people had told me and the lives they had described to me back in 2006 had stayed with me. And at that point, I became determined to write a book about it. So by the time I actually came to write a book proposal about it, which I did at the beginning of 2015, I'd already been thinking about this story for a long time, for almost 10 years. And so then, when I started work on the book itself, I really kind of pitched entirely into this subject. So I ended up working off the basis of more than 10 years of research when I came to write the book.
Well, I think we probably should leave it up there. You've given us a lot of time here and such a thoughtful discussion here, such a great book. But we do...
Oh, thank you. No problem.
Yeah, and in all seriousness, we do want to have you... When is the book about the Challenger disaster? When is that due out? Any idea?
Not till 2023.
Okay, well, we'll still be doing the show.
Great.
We'll have you back
I'd love
on.
to come back.
Yeah, good. All right, Adam, thanks so much for all your time, not just in this conversation, but in the days... in the days leading up in our discussions. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Thanks, Joe.
Take care. Thanks. Yep.
Okay, bye.